On the morning of December 1st, 1943, Colonel Don Blakeslee pushed the throttle forward on a P-51B Mustang and lifted off from RAF Boxted in Essex, England. 22 other Mustangs followed him into the cold winter sky. They were heading toward Belgium on a fighter sweep, the very first combat mission for America's newest long-range escort fighter. German radar operators watching the formation that morning noted the aircraft type, logged their heading, and filed routine intelligence reports. New American fighters, probably another variant of the P-47, range estimated at 400 miles maximum. The German analysts were wrong, catastrophically wrong, but they would not realize how wrong for another 8 months, by which time the Luftwaffe would be dying in the skies over Germany, shot down by pilots who had trained for nearly a year on tactics the Germans never knew existed. The 23 P-51Bs that flew that December morning represented something unprecedented in the air war over Europe. They were not just new fighters. They were the culmination of 8 months of intensive training, tactical development, and operational doctrine that had been refined at airfields across the United States, while German intelligence remained completely unaware. The story of what the Luftwaffe did not know begins not in December 1943 over Europe, but in February of that same year at a wind-swept airfield in Tonopah, Nevada, where the 354th Fighter Group was learning to fly an aircraft they had never seen. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The 354th had been activated on November 15, 1942, at Hamilton Field in California. The unit was assigned Bell P-39 Airacobras for training. The P-39 was an adequate fighter at low altitude but performed poorly above 15,000 feet. The pilots knew they would eventually receive different aircraft for combat overseas, but nobody told them which type. Through winter and spring of 1943, the group trained relentlessly, 6-day work weeks, 6 sorties per day, air-to-air combat, bombing runs, strafing practice. They lived in tar paper shacks in primitive conditions. 3 pilots died in training accidents. The survivors became proficient in the P-39, learning formation flying, gunnery, and the basics of fighter tactics. Then, in November 1943, everything changed. The group received orders to deploy to England. They traveled by train across the United States to New York, boarded the HMS Athlone Castle, and crossed the Atlantic. When they arrived at Liverpool on November 1st, 1943, and began unloading cargo at the docks, pilots noticed something unusual. Crated on the ship alongside them were brand new North American P-51B Mustangs, olive drab paint, Packard Merlin engines, 450 caliber machine guns. The pilots had never flown this aircraft. Most had never even seen one. They were being asked to transition to a completely new fighter type, learn its systems, master its handling characteristics, and enter combat within weeks. This was the moment when German intelligence should have taken notice. A new American fighter group was arriving in England with a new long-range aircraft. But German analysts, focused on tracking known threats like the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning, failed to recognize the significance of the P-51B's arrival. They knew the Mustang existed. Early Allison-powered P-51As had been flying reconnaissance missions with the Royal Air Force since 1942. Those aircraft had limited high-altitude performance and posed no threat to German operations over the Reich. German intelligence officers assumed the new B model was simply another tactical fighter, similar in capability to aircraft already in service. They were wrong. The P-51B was fundamentally different from anything the Americans had fielded before. The Merlin engine, built under license by Packard, gave the Mustang exceptional high-altitude performance. The laminar flow wing design reduced drag. The internal fuel capacity was larger than any previous single-engine fighter, and most critically, the aircraft could carry external drop tanks that extended its range to distances German analysts considered impossible for a single-engine fighter. But the real advantage was not just the aircraft, it was the training. What the Luftwaffe never knew was that American pilots had been training on long-range fuel management, drop tank procedures, and extended escort tactics for 8 months before the first P-51Bs arrived in England. The training had not taken place on Mustangs. The aircraft did not exist in sufficient numbers yet, but the doctrine, the procedures, the operational concepts, all of that had been developed, tested, and refined while P-51B production ramped up at North American Aviation's plants in California and Texas. In March 1943, months before the 354th Fighter Group even knew they would fly Mustangs, the Army Air Forces had begun developing the tactical framework for long-range escort operations. Test pilots at Wright Field in Ohio flew experimental missions with various drop tank configurations. Engineers calculated fuel consumption rates. Tacticians war-gamed escort formations. Training officers developed curricula for teaching pilots how to manage fuel over extreme distances. By June 1943, when the first P-51Bs began rolling off the production line, the operational doctrine was already substantially complete. Pilots in training units across the United States were learning the procedures, even though they were still flying P-39s and P-40s. They studied fuel management charts. They practiced formation tactics designed for long-range missions. They memorized engine settings for maximum endurance. German intelligence monitored American training activities but failed to recognize what they were seeing. Luftwaffe analysts knew American pilots received extensive training before deployment. German pilot training by 1943 had been drastically shortened due to fuel shortages and combat losses. The typical German fighter pilot arriving at a frontline squadron in late 1943 had perhaps 200 hours of total flight time. American pilots arriving in the European theater had 400 to 500 hours. The Luftwaffe attributed this disparity to America's vast industrial capacity and unlimited fuel supplies. They assumed American pilots were simply spending more time learning basic flight skills. What German intelligence missed was that a significant portion of American training time was devoted to specific long-range escort procedures that had no equivalent in Luftwaffe doctrine. Consider the fuel management problem. A P-51B carried 184 gallons of fuel in its wing tanks and, from mid-production onward, 85 gallons in a fuselage tank behind the pilot. With two 75-gallon drop tanks, total fuel capacity reached 419 gallons. That fuel had to be managed carefully throughout a mission lasting 4 to 6 hours. The fuselage tank presented unique challenges. When full, it shifted the aircraft's center of gravity aft, making the Mustang unstable and dangerous to fly in combat. Pilots were instructed to burn fuel from the fuselage tanks first, during takeoff, assembly, and climb out before reaching enemy territory. Then they switched to the drop tanks. The drop tanks were consumed during the transit to the target area. By the time the formation reached hostile airspace, the fuselage tank was empty and the drop tanks were nearly dry. Pilots dropped the external tanks and switched to internal wing fuel for combat operations. This sequencing was critical. If a pilot entered combat with fuel still in the fuselage tank, the aircraft could enter an uncontrollable snap roll during high G turns. Multiple pilots died in training accidents before the procedures were fully refined. The survivors learned. They memorized the fuel consumption rates at different altitudes and power settings. They developed an instinctive sense for when to switch tanks. They learned to monitor their fuel state constantly, calculating remaining range, time to target, combat reserve, and fuel needed for return to base. This was not simple flying. This was systems management at a level of complexity that German pilots never encountered. German fighters like the Messerschmitt 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 had simpler fuel systems. One main tank in the fuselage, limited external tank capability. German doctrine assumed that fighter operations would take place relatively close to base. Takeoff, climb to intercept altitude, engage enemy bombers, land. Mission duration rarely exceeded 2 hours. Fuel management was straightforward. American doctrine was completely different. The mission profile for a P-51 escort operation looked like this. Takeoff from England, climb to 25,000 feet while forming up with the bomber stream, transit across the English Channel and into France or Belgium or the Netherlands. Continue inland, escorting bombers deep into Germany. Remain with the bombers during the bomb run. provide cover during the egress, return across hundreds of miles of enemy territory, cross the Channel, land in England, often in marginal weather, sometimes at night or in fog. Total mission time, 4 to 6 hours. Total distance, sometimes exceeding 1,000 miles. Luftwaffe intelligence knew American bombers were being escorted by fighters, but German analysts consistently underestimated the range of those escorts. When P-47 Thunderbolts first appeared over Germany in spring 1943, equipped with drop tanks, Luftwaffe tacticians adjusted their doctrine. They instructed German pilots to wait until the American escorts turned back before attacking the bomber formations. The tactic worked. P-47s with drop tanks could escort bombers perhaps 300 miles from their bases in England. Beyond that radius, the bombers flew unprotected, and Luftwaffe fighters slaughtered them. Then, the P-38 Lightning arrived with longer range, and the protective radius expanded. Luftwaffe pilots adapted again. They waited longer before attacking. They positioned their formations further inland. They struck after the escorts reached their fuel limits and turned for home. This was the tactical situation when the P-51B entered service in December 1943. German intelligence estimated the new Mustang's combat radius at perhaps 400 miles, comparable to late-model P-47s with conformal drop tanks. The Luftwaffe assumed they could continue using their established doctrine: wait for the escorts to leave, attack the bombers when they were vulnerable. It was a reasonable assumption based on the available intelligence. But it was completely wrong. The P-51B with drop tanks could fly 800 miles from base and still have fuel for 30 minutes of combat. Berlin was 600 miles from England. Every industrial target in Germany was within reach. The Luftwaffe did not discover this until it was too late. On December 13th, 1943, 12 days after the 354th Fighter Group flew its first combat mission, 55 P-51Bs escorted B-17 bombers to Kiel, approximately 480 miles from their base in England. German fighters intercepted the formation and discovered to their shock that the American escorts did not turn back. The Mustangs fought over the target, shot down 6 German aircraft, and returned to England without loss. Luftwaffe squadron commanders filed incredulous combat reports. American fighters had reached Kiel. How was that possible? German intelligence analysts reviewed the reports and concluded that the mission must have been exceptional, perhaps conducted with specially modified aircraft or favorable weather conditions that reduced fuel consumption. Standard P-51s could not routinely reach that distance. The analysts were wrong again. Over the following weeks, P-51Bs appeared deeper and deeper inside Germany. On January 5, 1944, they escorted bombers to Kiel again, destroying 16 German fighters. On January 11, 1944, they reached Halberstadt, approximately 390 miles inland. On January 30, 1944, they escorted bombers to Brunswick, 400 miles from England. German fighter units adapted as best they could. They attacked earlier in the mission profile before the escort's advantage in range became decisive. They focused on shooting down the escort fighters rather than the bombers, recognizing that the Mustangs were the real threat. But Luftwaffe losses climbed steadily. The P-51 was not just a long-range fighter, it was also an exceptional dogfighter. At altitudes above 20,000 feet, the Merlin-powered Mustang was faster than the Messerschmitt 109G and the Focke-Wulf 190A. It could turn with either German fighter in sustained combat. It could outdive both. German pilots who engaged P-51s in combat reported that the American fighter seemed to have no weakness. If a German pilot tried to run, the Mustang caught him. If he tried to fight, the Mustang outmaneuvered him. If he tried to dive away, the Mustang followed and shot him down at low altitude. The only advantage German fighters retained was armament. The Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf carried 20mm or 30mm cannons that hit harder than the Mustang's 50 caliber machine guns. A single cannon hit could destroy an aircraft. The Mustang needed multiple hits, but the Mustang's superior handling meant American pilots could position for those hits more easily than German pilots could line up cannon shots. By February 1944, the Luftwaffe was facing a crisis. American bombers were striking targets throughout Germany with effective fighter escort. German fighter losses were accelerating. Experienced pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. And still, German intelligence did not fully understand what they were facing. Luftwaffe analysts knew the P-51B had long range. Combat reports made that obvious, but they did not know why. They assumed it was simply a matter of fuel capacity. Bigger tanks, longer range. The Germans had no idea that American pilots had trained for 8 months on the specific procedures required to use that fuel efficiently. They did not know about the extensive fuel management training. They did not know about the drop tank employment tactics. They did not know about the formation procedures designed to minimize fuel consumption during long transits. They did not know about the engine management techniques that extended range without sacrificing performance. German pilots, by contrast, received minimal training on fuel management. Luftwaffe doctrine assumed pilots would learn through experience. But by 1944, experience was a luxury few German pilots survived long enough to acquire. New pilots arrived at frontline squadrons with 200 hours of training. They flew their first combat mission. Many died on their second or third mission, killed by veteran American pilots flying aircraft they barely understood. The training gap was enormous and growing. In February 1944, General James Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force and changed American fighter tactics dramatically. Previously, American fighters had been ordered to stay close to the bomber formations. Their mission was defensive, to protect the bombers from attack. Doolittle gave his fighters freedom to hunt German aircraft aggressively. If enemy fighters were spotted forming up, American fighters were to attack them before they could reach the bombers. If German aircraft were seen taking off, American fighters were to strafe them during their vulnerable climb-out. The goal was not just to protect bombers. The goal was to destroy the Luftwaffe completely. The new doctrine was devastating. American fighters with long range could patrol anywhere over Germany. German pilots taking off from their airfields could be attacked immediately. German formations assembling for intercept missions could be bounced by roaming American fighters before they ever reached the bombers. There was no safe phase of operations. Every moment, from engine start to landing, German pilots were vulnerable to American attack, and the Americans had the fuel endurance to maintain this pressure for hours. The Luftwaffe had no counter-tactic. German fighters needed to form up before engaging enemy bombers. Large formations provided mutual support and concentrated firepower, but forming up took time. And during that time, German aircraft were vulnerable to attack by American escorts that could now range freely across German airspace. On March 4th, 1944, the strategic situation reached a breaking point. Over 600 American heavy bombers struck Berlin for the first time with full fighter escort. 174 P-51 Mustangs accompanied them on the 1,100-mile round trip. The Mustangs fought German defenders over the heart of the Third Reich. They shot down 16 Luftwaffe fighters and lost only 4 aircraft. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, reportedly said that when he saw Mustangs over Berlin, he knew the war was lost. Berlin was supposed to be beyond the range of American escort fighters. German air defenses had been organized around that assumption. Bomber formations approaching Berlin would be intercepted by massed Luftwaffe fighters over Brandenburg and Mecklenburg hundreds of miles before reaching the capital. The bombers would be torn apart by overwhelming German numerical superiority in airspace, where no American escorts could protect them. That was the doctrine. That was what German defensive planning assumed. The appearance of 174 P-51s over Berlin shattered that assumption completely. German intelligence finally began to grasp the magnitude of the problem. Luftwaffe analysts studied captured P-51s, interviewed prisoners, and analyzed combat reports. They discovered that the Mustang's range was not simply a matter of fuel capacity. It was the result of months of tactical development and pilot training that the Germans had never detected. The fuselage tank that American pilots burned first, then switched to drop tanks, then fought on internal wing fuel. The formation procedures that reduced drag and conserved fuel during long transits. the engine management techniques that balanced speed, altitude, and fuel consumption, the navigation planning that optimized routes to and from targets. All of this was new intelligence to the Luftwaffe, and all of it had been developed months before the first P-51B flew in combat. But by March 1944, when German intelligence finally understood what they were facing, it was too late to mount an effective response. The Luftwaffe was already dying. Pilot losses in February and March 1944 were catastrophic. During Big Week, a concentrated six-day bombing campaign in late February, Luftwaffe fighters threw themselves at American bomber formations in desperate attempts to stop the raids. The Americans lost heavily. Over 200 bombers were shot down, but Luftwaffe losses were worse. 262 fighters destroyed, 100 pilots killed, 90 wounded, 43 missing. Among the dead were squadron commanders, flight leaders, and experienced combat veterans who could never be replaced. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. Germany could train new pilots, but it took 6 months to produce a minimally competent fighter pilot, a year to produce a good one, 2 years to produce an excellent one. The Luftwaffe was losing pilots with 3, 4, 5 years of combat experience. They were replacing them with pilots who had 3 months of training. The skill gap was enormous, and the Americans kept coming. By April 1944, 14 of the 15 fighter groups in the 8th Air Force flew P-51 Mustangs. Hundreds of long-range escorts accompanied every major bomber raid. German fighter units launched interceptions and were systematically destroyed by American pilots who had trained for months on tactics the Luftwaffe never anticipated. The 354th Fighter Group, the pioneers who flew the first P-51B combat mission in December 1943, became the highest-scoring American fighter group of the war. 701 aerial victories, more than any other unit in the European theater. Their success was not luck. It was not superior numbers, though numbers helped. It was training. Months of training on fuel management, long-range operations, and escort tactics that the Luftwaffe never knew existed until it was too late. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, commander of Jagdgeschwader 77, was one of Germany's most experienced fighter leaders. He survived the war with 176 aerial victories. In post-war interviews, historians asked him when he realized the Luftwaffe could not win the air war. Steinhoff pointed to early 1944, the moment American fighters began appearing deep over Germany with the endurance to hunt Luftwaffe formations during their most vulnerable phase, forming up and climbing to intercept altitude. He said German pilots knew immediately that the tactical situation had changed fundamentally. But what shocked him most was learning after the war that American pilots had been training on those tactics for 8 months before they ever flew in combat. The Luftwaffe had known the P-51 existed. They had known it was coming to Europe. They had simply never imagined that the Americans would develop such comprehensive operational doctrine before deploying the aircraft. German doctrine was reactive: encounter a problem in combat, develop a solution, implement it. American doctrine was proactive: anticipate the operational environment, develop procedures, train pilots, then deploy. By the time the first P-51B entered combat, American pilots had already trained extensively on scenarios they would face over Germany. They knew how to manage fuel for missions exceeding 5 hours. They knew how to employ drop tanks effectively. They knew how to fight at the extreme edge of their range and still return home safely. The Luftwaffe learned about these capabilities only by facing them in combat. And by then, thousands of German pilots were already dead. The Luftwaffe's failure to understand American P-51 training doctrine created a cascade of tactical disasters throughout 1944. Each month, German fighter losses climbed while pilot quality declined. The Americans had built a system. The Germans were fighting a losing battle of attrition they could never win. Consider what happened on April 8, 1944. Major Egon Meyer, one of Germany's most successful bomber destroyers with 102 kills, led an interception against American B-17s, striking Brunswick. Meyer had pioneered the head-on attack against heavy bombers, recognizing that frontal attacks minimized exposure to defensive fire. His tactics had been studied throughout the Luftwaffe. On this mission, Meyer's squadron attacked from ahead of the bomber formation as planned. Then P-47 escorts dove from altitude. The escorts had been positioned above and behind the bomber stream, waiting for exactly this moment. Meyer's formation scattered. He was shot down and killed. He was 29 years old. The loss of pilots like Meyer represented more than statistics. These men were the institutional knowledge of the Luftwaffe fighter force. They trained new pilots. They developed tactics. They led by example. When they died, their knowledge died with them. The Americans understood this dynamic and exploited it ruthlessly. General Doolittle's February 1944 tactical change specifically targeted German fighter pilots. American fighters were ordered to pursue and destroy enemy aircraft wherever they could be found, on the ground, during takeoff, while forming up, during combat, while trying to land. Every phase of German fighter operations became a hunting ground for American pilots flying aircraft with the endurance to maintain constant pressure. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski of the 56th Fighter Group described the new tactics in a post-war interview. His unit flew P-47 Thunderbolts, not Mustangs. But the doctrine was identical. American fighters would arrive over Germany ahead of the bomber stream. They would locate German airfields and patrol at altitude, waiting. When German fighters took off to intercept the bombers, American fighters would attack them during their vulnerable climb-out. German pilots focused on gaining altitude and forming up were easy targets. If the Germans managed to form up and reach the bombers, American escorts engaged them in running battles that could last 30 minutes or more. The Americans had fuel to fight. The Germans did not. A Messerschmitt 109 or Focke-Wulf 190 carried fuel for perhaps 90 minutes of combat operations. After that, the pilot had to disengage and return to base or run out of fuel. American pilots knew this. They would pursue damaged German aircraft back toward their airfields, shooting them down during landing approach when they were slow and vulnerable. It was clinical. It was effective. It was devastating. By May 1944, Luftwaffe fighter losses exceeded 400 aircraft per month. Pilot casualties were even worse. Over 100 pilots killed monthly, 90 wounded, 50 missing or captured. The training pipeline could not keep pace. German flight schools were producing approximately 30 pilots per week. The frontline force was losing 200 pilots per month. The mathematics were unsustainable. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, commander of the Luftwaffe fighter arm, compiled detailed reports documenting the crisis. He sent them to Goering, to the Air Ministry, to anyone who would listen. The report stated clearly that the fighter force was being destroyed through attrition. New pilots were arriving at the squadrons with inadequate training. They were dying within days of their first combat mission. Experienced leaders were being killed faster than they could pass on their knowledge. The Americans had air superiority. They had better aircraft. They had better trained pilots. And most critically, they had operational doctrine that the Germans could not counter. Galland's reports were ignored. Goering refused to acknowledge the crisis. The Reichsmarschall insisted that German pilots simply needed more courage, more determination, more fighting spirit. Technical problems could be solved, production could be increased. But the fundamental issue was morale. If German pilots fought harder, they would prevail. This was delusional thinking, but it was consistent with Nazi ideology. The Führer demanded miracles. Senior commanders pretended miracles were possible. Reality was something that happened to other people. The reality was brutal. On June 6, 1944, the Allies invaded Normandy. The Luftwaffe was supposed to contest the invasion with massive fighter and bomber strikes against the landing beaches. Luftflotte 3, responsible for defending France, had 481 aircraft available on June 5th. On D-Day, the Luftwaffe managed to fly 319 sorties. The Allies flew 14,674. Many Allied soldiers did not see a single German aircraft during the first week of the invasion. The disparity was complete. The Luftwaffe had been defeated not just through losses of aircraft, but through the systematic destruction of its pilot corps by American fighters that could range anywhere, fight for extended periods, and return home safely. What the Germans never understood until it was too late was that American success was not simply a matter of industrial production. Yes, America built more aircraft. Yes, America had more fuel. Yes, America could replace losses quickly, but the decisive advantage was training and doctrine. American pilots arriving in the European theater in mid-1944 had 400 to 500 hours of flight time. They had trained extensively on instrument flying, formation procedures, navigation, gunnery, and tactical combat. They had practiced fuel management for long-range missions. They understood how to employ drop tanks effectively. They knew engine settings for maximum endurance. They had been taught to work as teams, not individuals. German pilots arriving at frontline squadrons in mid-1944 had 200 hours of training, sometimes less. They had minimal instrument time. Their gunnery training was abbreviated due to ammunition shortages. Their tactical training was rushed. They had little experience with fuel management because training flights were kept short to conserve fuel. When these pilots encountered veteran American pilots flying superior aircraft using tactics developed over months of training, the outcome was predictable. The German pilots died. By July 1944, Luftwaffe fighter losses exceeded 500 aircraft per month. Over 50 pilots were dying every single day. Every single day. The Americans continued pressing their advantage. On missions to targets deep in Germany, P-51 Mustangs would escort the bomber stream to the target, fight off Luftwaffe interceptors, follow the bombers back toward England, then break off and conduct fighter sweeps over German airfields, strafing parked aircraft and shooting down anything that tried to take off. These sweeps were possible only because the Mustang had the range to escort bombers to Berlin and still have fuel for low-level strafing attacks on the return flight. German pilots called it freie Jagd, free hunting. The Americans called it air superiority. Whatever the name, it meant that German fighter operations over their own territory had become nearly impossible. Even when German pilots managed to intercept bomber formations and shoot down several bombers, they often lost more fighters than they destroyed bombers. The exchange rate that had once favored the Luftwaffe 3 or 4 to 1 had reversed completely. By late 1944, American pilots were achieving kill ratios of 5 to 1, 10 to 1, sometimes higher. In November 1944, Galland launched one final attempt to change the strategic situation. He gathered 500 fighters for a massive, coordinated attack against American bomber formations. The operation, called Grosser Schlag, the Big Blow, was intended to inflict such heavy losses on the Americans that they would be forced to suspend daylight bombing temporarily. Göring approved the plan. Then Hitler intervened and ordered the fighters to support the Ardennes offensive. Instead, the operation that became known as the Battle of the Bulge. The fighter reserves were dispersed to tactical support missions. Many were destroyed by Allied ground attack aircraft. The pilots who survived returned to find their airfields under constant attack by American fighters that could roam freely across Germany. By January 1945, the Luftwaffe fighter force existed primarily on paper. There were aircraft. German factories were still producing Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s by the hundreds, but there was insufficient fuel to fly them. There were no experienced pilots to lead formations. There was no cohesive tactical doctrine. The Americans had won not through a single decisive battle, but through systematic attrition that destroyed the Luftwaffe's ability to function as an effective fighting force. Galland was relieved of command in January 1945. Göring blamed him for the Luftwaffe's failures, the constant complaints, the pessimistic reports, the criticism of leadership. Galland had undermined morale. He had failed to inspire his pilots to achieve victory through willpower and determination. Hitler intervened and allowed Galland to form an elite jet fighter unit, Jagdverband 44, equipped with Mi-262 aircraft. Galland gathered 10 holders of the Knight's Cross, experienced aces who had survived years of combat. They flew the jets beginning in late March 1945. The Mi-262 was faster than any Allied fighter by 100 miles per hour. It could break through escort screens and attack bombers without being intercepted. But even with superior technology, Jagdverband 44 achieved limited success. There were too few jets, there was insufficient fuel, and by April 1945, Germany was collapsing from all directions. On April the 26th, 1945, Galland led 12 Mi-262s to intercept American bombers south of Munich. While engaging the formation, his aircraft was hit by fire from a P-47 Thunderbolt. The jet's engines were damaged. Metal splinters from the instrument panel struck his right knee. He managed to crash land the crippled aircraft near Munich. 8 days later, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe ended. Galland survived. In post-war interviews, historians repeatedly asked him when he knew Germany would lose the air war. His answer was always the same. Early 1944, the moment American fighters began appearing deep over Germany with the endurance to hunt Luftwaffe formations during their most vulnerable phases of operation. But what shocked Galland most was learning years later that American pilots had been training on those long-range escort tactics for 8 months before the first P-51B flew in combat. The Luftwaffe had known the aircraft was coming. They had simply never imagined the Americans would develop such comprehensive operational doctrine before deploying it. German intelligence had failed at the most fundamental level. They had focused on counting aircraft, tracking production numbers, estimating technical specifications. They had never considered that the real American advantage was not technology, but training. Months and months of training on fuel management, drop tank procedures, formation tactics, and escort operations that gave American pilots a decisive edge in combat. By the time German intelligence understood what they were facing, thousands of Luftwaffe pilots were already dead. The survivors faced an enemy they could not defeat because they had never been trained to fight the kind of war the Americans were waging, long-range escort operations requiring precise fuel management, multi-hour combat missions, aggressive pursuit of enemy aircraft across hundreds of miles of airspace. These were tactics that American pilots had practiced extensively before ever seeing combat. German pilots learned about them by dying. The P-51 Mustang destroyed more enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat than any other Allied fighter. Nearly 5,000 German planes fell to Mustang pilots. The aircraft was exceptional, but the pilots were what made it truly devastating. They had trained for months, in some cases nearly a year, on the specific procedures required to exploit the Mustang's capabilities fully. The Luftwaffe never knew that training had occurred. They discovered it only when American fighters appeared over Berlin with enough fuel to fight for 30 minutes and still fly 600 miles home to England. By then it was too late. The air war was lost. The Luftwaffe was dying, and Germany's defeat was inevitable. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.